Going to be spending the day in Genesis today, at least for my part. We're going to be. Yeah, I mean I'll hit Leviticus too, but in church. Genesis 14. Wow, Smurf, we don't have much time. All right. We never do. I know. One of these days we'll get our act together, and then the Lord will come back. I think He's just waiting for us to get our act together. All right, so our memory verse, I've been working on this. I haven't got it yet either. So Hebrews 11:8.
Funny you just said it. I was thinking last week, you know what the last question should have been in the quiz? What's the memory verse?
Well, I can tell you what it is. I can't tell you what it is.
For the teachers, you mean? Yeah. One by one. Let's go.
So,
cover your ears.
Remember, Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And just underscores the faith in Abraham's life that kind of, did that look better, or did you not see them, or were you not there?
This is the verse I'm reading. I just want to print it out. And she's going to do it over again. I'm going to help her in about 15 minutes. I'll go up and
Okay.
she's going to do it all over again.
Yeah. Awesome.
No.
So we get to Genesis 14. I'm assuming Pastor Carl did okay last week. I haven't heard anything to the contrary, so he usually does well. He taught Sunday school last week.
Oh, that's right.
So.
Sorry, no, I was over there typing a lot.
Yeah, it was just another one of those days, I'm sure. But yeah, we do have a lot of those kind of days around here. I don't know if we're probably disorganized, or just too busy.
I think
Yes, and yes.
Not.
Well, last week was, too sudden. There's no way to plan for that.
I think last week was more along the lines of don't want for earthly possessions.
Okay.
I think that's what Carl said. Even going on a job and not trying to step on people on the way up.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Cool. So Genesis chapter 14 is actually kind of weird in the narrative of Abraham's life. This is the one chapter that stands out as odd. Because when you think about Abraham, you think about a guy who was a man of faith. I mean, that's what our memory verse underscores. And really you see that throughout, that his was a life of faith that manifested in obedience. You see him as a guy who worshiped God a lot. You see him building altars all over the countryside, praying to God a lot, very committed to God. Still human, still had some weaknesses. But Genesis 14 stands out as a real contrast, but not a contrast that says, oh, this is not like him, or this can't be like him. But just that this is a contrast that is potentially normal in the life of a person, especially in the life of a man, and a man like Abraham, who is a leader of men. And we find ourselves actually in I sometimes have called this the First World War, because you have this serious war that starts off in Genesis 14. I'll do some of the reading this morning. There's a lot of funky names in here, so I will spare you. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. So you have these two basic confederacies, 5 kings and 4 kings, and there's not a lot of clarity on who these particular kings are, historically speaking. The closest that we're able to come is that Chedorlaomer may be a reference to, and I'm looking, I forgot the guy's name just that fast. What was his name? Hammurabi. If you'll remember, there is the oldest legal code known in the world was written by a king named Hammurabi who lived in Samaria. And there is some conjecture that Chedorlaomer, who does seem to be the lead on this, may be a reference to Hammurabi, who was a bit of an empire builder himself. Unfortunately, we don't know enough from the text to make that a definite kind of a statement. It fits and it's a possibility, but it's not a definite possibility, and I would certainly never throw that as an answer in jeopardy, because it's not that clear. But we get these 5 kings. They're allied with these against these 4 kings, and there was a bit of a dust up, and we're finding this in the Valley of Siddim, which we'll run across actually a couple places in the Old Testament, the Vale of Siddim or the Valley of Siddim, which is a valley that's in the area of the Salt Sea. Anybody know a different name for the Salt Sea? The Dead Sea, right. We're still in the same region, and so we're in that same vicinity that much of the Old Testament is going to be centered on. And so there was a bit of a fight there, and the 4 kings who lost it, which was like Sodom and Gomorrah and those guys, end up paying tribute to specifically Chedorlaomer, and that gets divided among the kings who are allied with him. And so we continue in verse 5. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked because they revolted. So they came and they attacked. I just lost my place. They attacked the Rephaim in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Sheva, Kirathim. These words are getting too big even for me. And the Horites in the mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazon Tamar. Now, if you were to take your map, you could fix some of these places in it. They're harder to see, but there are some places we can get here. Kadesh, for instance, is a place that we do know a little bit more about as a city name. Kadesh Barnea is it's the southern entrance along the trade routes to Canaan. When Israel left Egypt and they were getting ready to go into the land the first time, the place they were going to come into the land was at Kadesh. And so that's the southern border along the trade routes into the land of Canaan. So we get all this is in that southern Canaan area. The Amalekites likewise live in that general vicinity. And so we get an idea anyway of where they are. In verse 8, the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, whom dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And so in this military campaign, they get to the place where they battle these 5 kings against these 4 kings. In the valley of Siddim, around the Salt Sea, there's also some tar pits in that area. And Sodom and Gomorrah, those kings get their butts kicked. And so they all end up running, their armies collectively start running away. Now, this sounds like a huge military deal, and it probably was for its day. We would look at this as like, a couple thousand savages attacking each other. I mean, understand that, and we'll see this as we get a little bit further down. Though these 5 kings had a standing army, it wasn't the standing armies that we'd see later on of, hundreds of thousands, millions of soldiers. There was still a lot, not a question. But we're talking about a time where a standing army was not actually a normal thing to have. Typically, your army was all the guys who could drop their rakes and grab a sword, or maybe just take the rake because they didn't have a sword, and you just went out and you just had to go at it. The fact that Chedorlaomer and the kings that were allied with him had actually put together a standing army and went out on a military campaign of conquest just is all by itself, even if he had done nothing else, is a big flex of the muscles. It's a big flex of the wealth and the power that this guy had to say, hey, I have a standing army. You look like you have a question. Excuse me one second. I don't want to advertise that over the internet. All right. Sorry, I just didn't want to post my computer password to the internet at large. Anyway. So, they have this going on. The fact that the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, who were smaller cities, there was some wealth, some power, but not enough to say we have a standing army. They blew the whistle, they rang the bell. Everybody grabbed the sharpest thing they could find, and they went out to defend their home. And it didn't go so well. And so they get their heads handed to them. And so the important note actually is in verse 12, they also took Lot. And here's where the story really, why this story is included, comes into focus. They took Lot, Abram's brother's son. So they took Lot, Abram's nephew. They'd already divided. They took him captive. They took all of his stuff. This is where we have, an issue. Verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were allies with Abram. And so we find Abraham here in the area of Mamre. This is further to the west of where they are. Eshcol and Aner, you're dealing with areas that would later be populated largely by the Philistines, not too far from the Mediterranean coast. So they're about the same areas, all this action going on, but further enough to the west that they weren't involved. And so Abraham's there. He's got some friends in the area, and so we find these two guys who are considered allies. And again, the whole tenor of this chapter is very militaristic, and so they were friends, but allies is what they were also serving as. Now, verse 14, now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. This is a significant verse because this is Abraham flexing his muscles as well. You live in a time where you have some wealthy landlords, you have landowners and property owners. The fact that he has 318 servants born in his own house. These are now second generation servants. They are born and loyal to Abraham. But they were also trained servants. These were men who he'd actually taken the time to equip and train in warfare. And so Abraham, despite, in addition to all of his other wealth, the servants, the camels, all of the livestock, all of the money, he has a standing army. 318 men doesn't sound like much, but these are 318 trained men. That is a small standing army. And this is, even in our own day, if you have your own security force, private security force of 318 people to secure you, you're doing pretty good. I don't even have 318 friends who have my back, let alone 318 employees, who are trained. And so, Abraham here, so he gets his guys, he arms them, and they go to war. Now, Dan is another interesting location name because Dan is actually the northern border of what would later be Israel. And so we're getting kind of to somebody living later. This would have been a more contemporary reference as well. So Kadesh being the southern border of Israel, Dan being the northern border of Israel. And so he chases them the length of, you're talking several hundred miles north at this point, probably 200-300 miles north that he has gone chasing these kings. Verse 15, he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And so now they're chasing north and to the east of Dan, and they're actually beating them as they go. So he brought back all of the goods and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So he goes up, he chases this army, he attacks them at night, and he continues, as they go in retreat, he continues to press the attack through their retreat to the place where he's able to finally secure Lot and all of the goods from Sodom and Gomorrah and all the stuff that these kings had just taken captive. Abraham freed them all up. Not bad when you take your soldiers and you go attack him. Now we find that there was more than just 318 guys. We'll get this in a minute. The allies of Abraham came with him, and so his force would have been bigger. Not huge, but bigger. And definitely smaller than the kings that he was fighting against, and that's why attacking under cover of night, pursuing through a retreat, these are tactics which would have helped a smaller force overcome a larger force. So Abraham knew a little bit about tactics. And the king, verse 16, he brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as all the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, a tithe of all. So he gave him 10% of all of the stuff that he brought back to Melchizedek. Now the king of Sodom said to Abraham, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. He's just like, give me the people, I'm not worried about the stuff. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. And so Abraham says, I'm not taking a thing, because I serve God, not you, and God made me wealthy, not you, and I like it that way. The guys who went with me, if they want to take some of for their stuff, that's their business. They're my allies. They're not my servants. And so you have these four, almost, they're not quite as big as a city-state, but definitely these four, landowners, these wealthy guys who took their army up and cleaned house. What's interesting about this is a couple things. First of all, is this is a really militaristic side of Abraham that we don't see anywhere else in the Bible. Throughout Scripture, we see Abraham the obedient, we see Abraham the faithful, we see Abraham the worshiper, we see Abraham a lot of different things. And when it came to himself and his own relationship to God, we see a man who is relatively at peace. And yet when it came time to go to war, Abraham did not hesitate and he did not lose. And so this is a very different side of him. Here, when life was in jeopardy, in this case, the life of his family was in jeopardy, Lot's life, his children, Abraham did not shy away from physical violence if that's what was required to preserve life. And so we see that in Abraham, a different side. The other thing that we see is we run across this guy named Melchizedek, and we're told that he is the prince of Salem. Paul, writing in the book of Hebrews, is actually going to revisit this guy and talk about Melchizedek, who Abram gave tithes to, and says, Paul makes the point that Melchizedek represents a priesthood that is different and superior to the Jewish priesthood. And the basis of that argument is because the Jewish priesthood, still represented by Abraham, actually gave a tithe to Melchizedek, and the lesser tithes to the greater, and not the other way around. And so he's making the point in Hebrews that Jesus is going to be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, not after the order of Aaron, because it is a superior priesthood. Melchizedek was not a Jew, because Jews didn't exist at this point at all. And there's some conjecture as to who Melchizedek was. Paul in Hebrews says that he sprung without father or mother. That this Melchizedek, though he was the prince of Salem, was really an unknown otherwise. And there's conjecture, and again, it's not substantiated, but it's reasonable, is that this guy actually may have been Shem. coming off the ark, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This may have been Shem. You think about, if you look at the chronologies, before the flood, people living 700-800 years. After the flood, or Noah's sons living like 500 odd years, and then immediately that halves again. Their sons only live like 200, 250 years. And so even though several generations have passed, Shem may have still been alive, very old, 400 or 500 years old, but he did live that long. And the chronology works out that he could have still been alive to the place where Abraham could have actually known Shem, which is really cool. You imagine that conversation. So what was the ark like?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about that this morning. So, but again, just a different kind of thing. And what we see on this is Abraham, he relies upon God, but that reliance upon God isn't as, I don't want to say complete. It isn't that naive to say that I don't have to do anything. I rely upon God, but I still may need to raise my army and chase my nephew down and free him. I rely upon God for my wealth, not for another king. But there are times that action is needed. And so it's a very interesting story of Abraham. We don't usually tell this story often because it's so almost at odds with the rest of his life, and yet still a pretty cool and pretty important story, actually, since it finds its way all the way into the book of Hebrews. It's good to know. Questions, comments?
He's still Abram here.
Yeah, he's still Abram. I go back and forth in how I say it. We'll actually get to where God changes his name to Abraham, and so it's hard to remember. It's just Abram, not Abraham. But yeah.
Just kind of cool. I wonder what the king's thought was when he said, "No, I'm not taking your stuff. I don't want you to think that you."
What are you going to do? You going to argue with the guy who just cleaned everybody else's clock?
Yeah.
Nah.
The king's going. This guy's weird.
Yeah. What do you mean you don't want my money? All right.